So Alan must have been worried that I wasn't going to say anything nice about him because he wrote this up. It was prepared for me. So I'm just going to read you this about Alan, and I actually have a little bit of surprise for you. Alan's partner in the book, Tom Jokum, I'm going to say that wrong, is also here tonight and is going to speak. And then when I was at our city council meeting the other night, my friend, I call him the judge, our corporation counsel, Joseph Macy, came up to me and he said, hey, I hear you're doing this thing about mortal remains. I was the defense attorney. And I said, you were? He goes, yes, but in the book they call me Robert Macy. Apparently he had a little falling out with the author, I'm not really sure. So they gave him a different name. I know. I don't know why anyone wouldn't love you, Judge. But he is also here, and he is also going to speak. He was a defense attorney in one of the trials. So, Rep. Silvia, I did not write this, is a lifelong resident of Fall River, educated in Fall River Public Schools, a graduate of BMC Durfee High School, class of 1970, was before I was born. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, June 1970, a Vietnam veteran. Thank you very much. Honorably discharged. He studied at Bristol Community College in Fall River, Northeastern University in Boston, his Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice, Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island, and Master of Science, Human Development and Administration. His professional experience includes 22 years as a police officer in the city of Fall River. Thank you very much again. A police investigator in the sexual abuse unit, and 19 years as a detective in major crimes. In 2012, he was honored to be elected as our state legislator. He is the state legislator in the South End. 7th Bristol District. He served as Vice Chairman, Joint Committee, Veterans and Federal Affairs, 2015 to 16. He presently serves as Vice Chairman, Joint Committee, Public Safety and Homeland Security, Joint Committee, Ways and Means, and Joint Committee, Revenue. On November 6th, Representative Silva was re-elected to serve his 4th term in Massachusetts General Court as state legislator of Fall River 7th Bristol District. So without further ado, because he's been ready since 5:15, this is our former detective and our state representative, Alan Silvia.
Thank you. I've been just dying to come up here. First of all, I didn't have any idea that this would draw such a crowd. Now, I've done this on 2 other occasions. I discussed this with Pam. I did this in Attleboro several years ago for a book club, and there were about 40 people. I didn't expect that many people then. And discussed the book then. It went on for a couple of hours. And I did it in New Bedford, at the New Bedford Public Library, with a small number of people. Of course, they all kept it going with many questions later. So tonight is a little different because it's in Fall River, where it all took place. And when you think about it, you know, right in this building, right where we are, some of those defendants, first of all, how many people in this room have I arrested? I'm just kidding, just kidding. So right in this building, this was the area that all of this had taken place. You know, this was the Washington Club downstairs. It was, there were 5 bars within a 2-block radius. You can imagine what that looked like in the 1970s. So this was the Washington Club. Up here was the Hub Pool Room. And in one of the, if you go through your book and you see after Detective Joquin and I dropped Karen Marsden off at St. Mary's Cathedral because she refused protective custody, this is where she came to meet Robin Murphy prior to them killing her at 3 o'clock that morning. So you're right in the building that Karen was in last, right in the same location that all of this took place. Of course, right here was the Washington Club. A few doorways down was Pigeon's Cafe. Does anyone remember these names? Pigeon's Cafe. Then up the street was Pier 14. Just a little further to the east was Charlie's. And then the Golden Pheasant. And I could go on because there were some that I really like, the Tremont and the Lincoln. But so there were a lot of bars, and in those days, this was a very different place. This was a location, these few blocks. When you think about it, it's amazing. When I think about it even still, and I talked to Detective Joquin earlier, call him Detective Joquin. We talked about it, it's amazing that right here was the police station, half a block away from where we are right now. That's where we worked. And in this 2-block, 3-block area was an incredible prostitution and drug problem at the time. We had traffic jams. To give you an idea, when I first went on the police department, I was in uniform division for about 1.5 years. Then I was assigned to the vice unit, which was prostitution and drugs. Well, of course, I grew my hair longer. You know, I looked like a hippie. So I could try to fit in, except everybody knew I was a cop. But so part of my job was to pick up these young ladies of the street and to arrest them. So I did that for a couple of years. I don't want to get too much into that because that's a story in itself. But as you can imagine, so this was really an area that was lots of crime, lots of violent episodes in the bars that on especially a Friday or a Saturday night. And prostitution, of course, with traffic jams. When I tell you traffic jams. Matter of fact, I'll just tell you a quick story. The last night I ever worked prostitution, the first night I ever worked prostitution, I was scared to death. I always had these stories in my head that someone was going to pull a razor blade out of my mouth and cut me. Well, that never happened. I scared the hell out of that girl when I arrested her. I started screaming in my car. I was afraid she was going to do something to me. But the last one I ever did, there was an officer in a, of course, we weren't using police cars. There was an officer behind me, a few cars away. I thought he was there, supposed to be watching me. He was picking up another girl. You become very lax when you're doing this. Anyway, I was at the corner near the pier. I went to negotiate with a young lady. She reached in my car, and she stuck a cigarette butt in my left eye. And the head of the cigarette remained in my eye, so I kept trying to brush it out, and it wouldn't come out of my eye. I had polyester pants on. I burned those. We wore polyester pants then. It was terrible. Anyway, I called. There was a code. There was a code that we would yell. You would never yell this unless you were in serious trouble. But there was a code we would say on the radio. We had handheld radios. They were about this big. I had it under my seat. I had a gold Pinto. It was a gold Pinto that I actually borrowed. We would borrow cars from Alan Paul so we could pick up the girls. So I had a gold Pinto, and when I even think of myself in a gold Pinto, it scares me. But I had a radio under the seat, and I made that call to let cars know that I was in trouble. And when you do that, police cars from all over the city come all at once. But you still have to wait. And the time you wait for them to get there, that 60 seconds, minute and a half, seems like forever when you're battling people, you know, when you're in gladiator condition. I was a young guy then, so. But anyway, I jumped out of the car. I tried to grab her. I ended up hitting her with the radio. I didn't want her to get away. And lo and behold, that was the last girl. I was out of work for 3 weeks because I had to go for surgery in my eye, and I almost lost my eye as a result of that burn. But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, 1979, October 13th, a little over 40 years ago. 40 years and, 10 days or so? 11 days? Was when Doreen Levesque was found in the morning under the bleachers. 1979 was a very different time in Fall River. Police work was very different then. When we discuss it today, you could never do what we did. You could never do today what we did. Much of what we did was unconventional, to say the least. But you couldn't do that today. So it was a different time. Give you an idea, today, if there's a homicide, and there are only like 2 in Fall River right now, this period of time, they consider that a high number. We had years, and that is good, we had years when we had 13 homicides, 12 homicides, 9. I investigated, was involved in at least 30 homicides in Fall River. Nobody should have to do 30 homicides, but we did. And it was just a very different period of time when today, officers go home at 9 o'clock at night and they wouldn't investigate to the next day. We would say, strike while the iron's hot. We would work around the clock until we couldn't stand up any longer. So we would just keep working. And as a result of that, we did we solved a lot of very good cases, some that were very difficult to solve. I just want to glance, because there were some things I wanted to preface before I started talking about the actual homicides. First of all, many of the people are deceased. That was 40 years ago. The author is deceased, Henry Scammell. We worked with Henry in putting the book together. Our main concern was getting the story out, making sure people heard this incredible case. When you think of Lizzie Borden is a walk in the park in comparison to the complexities of 3 homicides that were connected by a so-called cult that I will explain in a minute. So, very unique set of conditions and case. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things. The location I mentioned, police work in the 1980s, I mentioned. The book, Henry was a Harvard grad, Scammell, and he had authored books before, but never true crime. So that was unique in itself. He had done work with illnesses and diseases, rheumatoid arthritis. He wrote a book on Henry Scammell, but this was the first attempt. He had an interest in the case. We sat with him for many months. He worked off of direct police reports that we provided him and other factual information. So it is true. Some of the things you may read sound bizarre. They are bizarre, but it is true. And the last thing I think I wanted to mention was the issue around cults. Now, this was not a organized cult. So after this was all over, all the crimes were investigated, I ended up going to school in Oswego, New York. Most people don't know where that is. But I went to school because I wanted to learn more about cults, and I went to a 4-day school with some experts in the country, and I met some incredible people, and I became part of this national organization that would investigate or assist other departments in the country in investigating cult-related crimes. Neo-Nazi, satanic cult, Santeria, which is a Spanish cult. So I became very interested in the issue and learned, of course, that this was a self-styled, self-created cult. This was not an Anton LaVey. Anton LaVey is the person who called the father of Satanism in the United States. He wrote a book called The Shadows. Anyway, these folks used satanic Satan and cults to keep people in line. They tried to keep Karen in line by saying, we're going to kill your son. Satan knows. Satan knows what you're doing. This evolved from the Doreen Levesque all the way through Karen's death and disappearance. The Satan issue kept coming up. It was learned by the public to the point where Carlton Viveris even came to us and said, please stop talking about cults. We don't want the city to be known about cults. It was a major issue. Carlton was the mayor back then, if any of you remember. This was a self-styled cult, not organized at all used to keep people in line. However, that being said, it was very evil. And when I say evil, it was probably the darkest time that I can ever remember. Now, if anybody knows, I'm a pretty spiritual person. I go to church every week. I pray a lot. And I felt that same way about my faith then, but even more so in the sense that the evil was all around me during this period of time, and I've talked about this to my partners, but to the point where there were times in the evenings where I would sleep with a gun. I would have dreams of fist fighting with Satan. So it was a pretty bizarre period of time. So I just wanted to paint that picture for you before I started talking about some of the homicides. And we're going to try to get through this. I'm going to go through the homicides, and I know Judge Macy is here. Judge Macy, Joe Macy, was the defense attorney for Andy Maltese. And he has some interesting information with that. And of course, Tom is going to say a few words, especially when people start asking some questions. But anyway, I want to take you back to January 13th, 1979. We had no cell phones. Can you imagine? I don't know how I live without a cell phone. But we had no cell phones. We had beepers. We had these little things that, and my beeper went off at about 5:45, 6 o'clock in the morning. I called into the police station, and they told me to head over to Diamond Vocational High School, and that's what I did. I know Tom received the same call because we arrived at about the same time. Under the bleachers was a young lady, face down, tied in front, just a blouse on, opened in the front, and nude. Her body was nude. As we examined the crime scene, it was obvious, very obvious to us, that her skull had been crushed with rocks to the point where it was unable to identify her. Of course, we brought our crime scene people in. We notified the district attorney's office at the time, District Attorney Ron Pina. He sent in a CPAC investigator to assist with the investigation. We collected rocks. We collected every possible physical evidence, piece of physical evidence that you could find. Of course, many of the rocks had hair on them from the smashing of the skulls. We didn't know who Doreen Levesque was at the time, so we took Polaroids at the scene. We processed the crime scene. Her body went over to St. Anne's. We were doing autopsies at both. Every time there was a suspicious death, whether it was suicide, overdose, or homicide, police officers had to attend that autopsy. So we went to lots of autopsies. We went to 3 or 4 autopsies a week. So we had that autopsy of Doreen Levesque at St. Anne's Hospital, and Dr. Ambrose Keeley, who we get to know very well, of course, long deceased, incredible, individual who could piece things together very well. We shortly, after a few days, identified Doreen. She was, of course, missing from New Bedford. She had occasionally worked the streets in Fall River as a prostitute. And much of our information came to us from the street. So we lived on the street as an investigator. We actually worked for a guy. His name was Captain Reese, Jack Reese. He was a tough guy to work for. He was one of those old-fashioned World War II detectives like you see in Barney Miller, you know. And a quick story I want to tell you. So when I was first assigned, I was assigned to Vice, but later on I was assigned, after I left the Vice unit, I was assigned to Major Crimes Division. So I report to Major Crimes Division, and when I get to Major Crimes, I knock on the door. It's on the 3rd floor of the old police station, and I walk in, and he said, "Don't sit down. You're not going to be here that long." So I said, "I'm Alan Silvia, Cap. I know who you are. I didn't ask for you, and I don't want you. Get the hell out." Now, I'm saying it nice. He added some other words. Get the hell out. So I didn't know what to think. You know, where am I going to go to work? I'm assigned to Major Crimes. Where am I going to go? So I walk out onto the hallway, and there's a police officer out there with a pork pie cap on. His name was Stanley Jereback. You remember him. He was the check guy for the city. He did all the forged checks. So I said, "How you doing, Stanley?" He said, "Kid, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. You got a college education. You belong teaching school. You shouldn't be here." I said, "Look, I'm assigned here. Where do I go? Are there any of those desks open?" He said, "Yeah, all of them." He says, "Take one." So I sat there. I worked there about 2 weeks before Captain Reese ever talked to me. But so he didn't like me at first, but so what he used to do was we had no computers, we had typewriters. So you would type a report, and he would take my report, and if there was a misspelled word, he would use a red ink pen, and he'd make a line through it. I had to type the report over again. Anyway, that slowly ended, but Tom will tell you later on how he felt about me when he left. He really did think I was the greatest investigator in the world. But lo and behold, so that as Doreen, as we get to identify Doreen, we start to learn more about her. We start to learn that she was working the streets in Fall River and that she had been warned to stay off the streets, not by the police, by the actual people who were working there, by Robin Murphy, by Carol Fletcher. Robin Murphy tried to control the street. Carl Drew tried to control the street. Keep in mind, Robin Murphy was 17 years old. It's amazing. It's amazing that Robin Murphy, 17 years old, would tell the other hookers and the other folks, don't work my street. Stay off of my street. I don't know any of you who knew Robin. She's obviously still alive. I say I saved her life. We saved her life because her and Carl would be dead if they were on the street. They would have overdosed by now or something else would have happened to them. So we actually saved their life by having them incarcerated. So Robin's still in. Carl Drew's there for the rest of his life. But as we identify Doreen Levesque and others start feeding us information about. That's when we started hearing about cults. We started hearing about Satan, about how Satan is controlling the young ladies on the street. Slowly, as this evolves, we become very familiar with those personalities who were involved. Carl Drew, Karen Marsden, Carol Fletcher. Who else, Tom? Cast of characters, all involved with this small group of people who really wanted to control what was going on the street. And from that, more and more information started to develop. And any of you who read the book, you see that it finds us in Sonny Sparta's apartment at Harbor Terrace. It was called Harbor Terrace then. It was probably the worst place to hang around, but we ended up hanging around there at night. We would bring them beer. We would give them beer. We tried to do everything we could to gain their friendship, so to speak. They never trusted us. We didn't trust them. But it evolved into a relationship where we started to learn lots of things. We started to learn more about the cult. We started to learn more about the characters involved. And in some of those situations that you read in the book with the howling and the changing of voice, Robin's voice changing in the bedroom, true. I heard her voice change. Sounded like a complete different person. There was a conjuring up, so to speak, a hailing of Satan in the apartment while we were there. They had Satan mural on the wall, Satan on the walls in the bedroom, and they would praise and hail Satan. Very strange, but that's what they did. Again, they did it to control people and had no idea anything of what they were doing. But all in all, it became very evil and very odd, and it all led itself to so many issues that took place after that. So the investigation continues. Lots of things happened. I'm sure some of you will ask about some of those instances that took place that you may have read about. There are some of those things were considered funny that happened. I question whether they're funny or not, but then suddenly we start losing people. So Karen Marsden was the weakest link. Robin, the strongest. In my opinion, and I know Judge Macy feels the same way, Robin was really the ringleader to all of these homicides. These 3 homicides, Robin was present for everyone. Robin participated in all of them. Robin ended up being the main witness against Andy Maltese, being the witness against Carl Drew. Robin gets less time. Carl Drew does the maximum amount of time. But that's how the story unfolds. But lots of issues that existed between the district attorney's office and the police. District Attorney Pena had very little regard or very little respect for the local police, except these crimes couldn't be investigated in the city without the local police. As I say, the police department was different then. We had about 15 detectives. They were all doing different crimes. Some were doing drugs, some were doing prostitution, some were doing checks. We were doing homicide and major robberies. But we knew the street. Any investigator that the DA would send in didn't know the street. So they either had to trust the people on the street or come to us. But they tried everything they possibly could not to come to us. So it ended up we would actually hide information from them. How bizarre is that? We would not give them information. We were ordered by Lieutenant Cagle, by Captain Reese, don't give them anything. We actually kept information that was needed in a homicide investigation from the district attorney and his people, because they weren't playing on the up and up. At first, we would give them information. We realized they were meeting people when we didn't have any knowledge of them meeting them. Not supposed to do that. So that separation evolved slowly. I know I'm going to probably miss something, but so here comes the sudden disappearance of Robin Murphy, of Barbara Raposa. Barbara Raposa, we had heard she was missing. She had been missing for a few weeks. And suddenly on a Saturday or Friday, we get a call that a man was walking his beagle out near Rusco Printing, out on Stephen Street, and the dog started licking this thing on the ground, and it was a dead body. The body had been decayed, frozen, thawed, over a several-week period of time, and the skin was dark charcoal gray. So obviously we went to that crime scene and secured that crime scene, and evidence we collected, I remember, there were stones used in every one of these crimes. There were stones used to crush the skull of Doreen Levesque. We found fragment of stones and cement in the skull of Barbara Raposa. And in Karen's Marsden case, we only had a skull left, a partial skull. So stones were used often in these crimes. We seized the evidence. Again, that body was, and I'll never forget it. I'm having a vision right now. I love when I have visions. So Andy Maltese will tell us about visions soon. But we bring this body, this cadaver, to Barbara Raposa, to St. Anne's Hospital, and we allow it to thaw. It's not a very good smell when it thaws. And I remember I used to do this trick. It's the first time I'm saying it publicly. So people would wonder, how can you stand being over a chest cavity that stinks so bad and it doesn't bother you? And I would put Vicks Vapor Rub in the nostrils of my nose. Of course, I didn't share that with everybody at the time. So they would think I was like this tough guy and go, like Kool-Aid, sometimes the odor was so strong that your eyes would water. That's how bad the gases were. Anyway, so you can have that vision. So we're not talking about modern hospitals of today. You're talking about a hospital at St. Anne's, the basement of St. Anne's. It wasn't very nice. It was dark. It was dingy. They had a couple of fluorescent lights. They had a table that had the drainage on it for the body fluids. And they had poor circulation. Doesn't help. So I remember the doctor asking us to open the window. And we opened the window, and all of a sudden I look, and there's a little kid looking down at the autopsy. So they say, hey, get out of there. Imagine, think of that today. That would never happen. That would impossible to happen today. But chasing kids away from the window while an autopsy's going on. But anyway, it was a terrible scene. We start to learn about this gentleman. His name was Andy Maltese. And we found out a lot about Andy Maltese because, well, let me tell you about hauntings. I'll tell you about that, too. A lot of things happened during this. So we start learning about Andy Maltese. We learned that Andy Maltese would have sex with Robin when she was 9 and 10 years old. So when you think of why these people turned out the way they did because they were mutilated and abused as children. Carl Drew the same way. Carl Drew's father would tie his feet and as punishment would send him into the well for dead animals, keep him underwater for a long period of time. Craziness. And so you wonder, how do people grow up and be misfits and criminals? Well, because of the kinds of things that happen to them. Anyway, Andy Maltese, and I know I'm speeding a little bit, but Andy Maltese was a very strange guy. I mean, he was strange. Joe's laughing, but Andy Maltese was so strange. So we pick up Andy Maltese at his home up to Flint, and we bring him into the police station. And I don't remember where he lived in Flint, but I think you drove to go pick him up.
Yeah, but I don't remember where it was.
What?
I don't remember where he was.
So he was picked up, he came into the station, and this is like 9 o'clock at night. Needless to say, we stayed right around the clock. We never left. But Andy Maltese, I want to tell you, he came in. Now, Andy Maltese had already been incarcerated at Barnstable for sex crimes prior. But he came in, his hair was slicked back, and he had a Texas belt buckle, cowboy boots, jeans, and one of those shirts, I hadn't seen many of them before, but the little pearl snaps on it. You know what I'm talking about? A Western shirt. And he was holding a Bible. That all scared the shit out of me when I saw that. I'm serious. And he had a Bible in his hand. And and like the first thing when I introduced myself to him, we informed him of his rights, of course. But the first thing he wanted to tell me was, you know, I was with Satan, but I'm now with God. The Bible. And it went on, and it is amazing that what transpired that night. Because what we had learned that Andy Maltese had already been talking to the state police. See, he wasn't supposed to do that. He had already been talking to the state police, and when he sits down as he gets comfortable, he says a crazy thing. Well, I was going to talk to you guys, but I got to wait for the big guy to get here, meaning the state police. That really turned us off. He shouldn't have said that. But I said, I'll tell you what, Andy, you can read it in the book. Nobody's coming in here. Matter of fact, I'll blow away anybody who comes down that hallway. Nobody's coming in here. We're the ones who are going to do this. We're the ones who are going to sit with you. They never came in. Andy was with us all night. He was the strangest guy. Well, of course, we were pretty strange too. So, but Andy had seen something that was on my desk, and it said, Detective Alan Silvia, what was it?
Psychic reader.
Psychic reader. And so I used that as much as I could with Andy. And Andy really believed that I was a psychic reader. To the point, if you read the book, you'll see that I had him close his eyes. I had him say, Andy, I can see you. I can see what you're doing. And Andy went for the ride with this. To the point when we finished with Andy was actually hovering. I can see where the body is. I can see. And we had him lead us. To Stevens Street, and where his dream was, show us where the body was. Isn't that damn? That's what you had to work with, counsel. It is. It's the truth. So, all night we were back and forth. I worked Andy over with the ability to see the future and to see what happened. And Andy really went for that. He wasn't a mean person, Andy. He wasn't a violent person. He had sexual related issues, and he had obviously, and he had. Don't forget, Andy was probably in his mid 40s back then. This is 1979, 1980, and much older than Robin. So he was with Robin when Robin was 10, and would pick her up from school and bring her to school. So Andy was much older than many of these people. Andy had a relationship with Barbara Raposa, and learned that Barbara was cheating on him, and one of the people she was cheating on him was Robin Murphy. So Robin Murphy and her had a love relationship, and Robin and Barbara and Andy go for a ride, and they're sitting in the car, and things happen. Andy tells us about his bag of trips. Do you remember that bag of tricks, Judge?
Do I remember? Oh, yeah, I remember.
So Andy said, I went to the trunk for my bag of tricks. I tried like, Andy, tell me what the bag of tricks consisted of. Well, there was some strange, there were dildos and implements of destruction, you know, handcuffs and all kinds of tools. And that's what was used on Barbara, I say by Robin. Of course, somehow or another, Andy gets involved. One of the things going back to the homicide under the bleachers is after they drove around with Doreen and they bring her to that spot and they stone her, Robin has every one of them pick up a stone and throw it. And she says, you know why I had you throw a stone? Because now you're all murderers. Well, Robin made them all murderers. And she made Andy a murderer because Andy played a very little role other than subduing Barbara. Robin killed, I think I can say that now, killed Barbara and testified against Andy, and Andy goes to jail. Now, the district attorney knew what he was doing in having Robin testify, be the chief witness against Andy. That was the only real evidence they had other than it happening in Andy's car, Andy's bag of tricks in the trunk and outside. So Robin played a role in that event. Andy went off to Bridgewater, I believe Bridgewater, or Barnstable.
We went to the hospital, it was in Barnstable, then he died.
Yeah, had a stroke. Had a stroke and,
The precursor.
yeah. So Andy died. Andy dies in jail under evaluation for some of his issues. The issues around Barbara Raposa lingered a little bit prior to that trial, but between the state police and the detectives at the police department. So that went on for a while. Again, Karen wasn't at the Barbara Raposa scene. Karen had a relationship with Robin, but Robin was always afraid of Karen. Was always looked at Karen as the weakest link. All the times we were ever in their presence, Barbara would never let us speak to Karen. Karen would always have her head down, always have her head low, always fearful of us, afraid to speak to us in any way. And that went on for the longest amount of time. Matter of fact, we went many, many months without ever speaking to Karen. Moving on to Karen Marsden's disappearance and death. So, and I know I'm skipping over some things, but some people will fill it in. Karen Marsden, we finally have an opportunity to talk to Karen Marsden. Carol Fletcher, if you read the book, you'll see Carol Fletcher, who is part of this lesbian relationship that they have with some of the ladies on the street. Carol Fletcher sets up a meeting with Detective Joquin and myself on County Street. I can see the house right now, to meet with Karen. Of course, Karen didn't know this. But Karen comes alone. Karen walks into the house. When she sees us, she starts screaming uncontrollably, because she knew she wasn't supposed to be with us. We calmed her down. We tried to talk to her. She ended up going for a ride with us. We talked about the green water at the Freetown State Forest, where Carl would take her and show her where he had killed people. She talked very little about Doreen Levesque, although we tried to get her to talk about that. But Karen knew that if Robin found out, Karen would be dead. She would be dead. She knew that so well, and I got on the telephone that night and called the chief of police at the time was Chief Andrade. And I called Chief Andrade at home. Tom Joquin was there in the car with me when we did that. And We called them at home, and we tried to put Karen in protective custody. She refused. We wanted to put her in a hotel in Dartmouth. She refused. She was fearful of her son. She thought they were going to kill her son that night if she didn't go back. What happened was Carol Fletcher goes to Robin and tells Robin that a meeting that Carol set up, went back to Robin to tell her that Karen had been talking with us. They killed Karen at 3 o'clock that morning. We dropped Karen off at St. Mary's Cathedral. We saw the door open. We saw a priest there. It was about, 11 o'clock at night. Then we found out later that they actually came right here to this building where she met Robin, and they drove away. So at 3 o'clock that morning, they killed Karen at Family Beach in Westport. They mutilated her body. Mutilated because over a period of over a mile, we found body parts. We found teeth. We found hair. We found an earring. We found a shoe. Amazing. Over such a huge, where they dragged her and beat her, had sex with her, and cut her head off. They cut her head off, and they kicked her head several times in the air like a football. Finally, only part of the skull remained. Now, we never found the rest of the body. Now, there was a pig farm near there. Some people thought, well, maybe the pigs ate it. But we never found the rest of the body. We only found a portion of the skull that we were able to identify with sinus and dental records, lower part of the skull, at St. Anne's, and we flew that information down to the FBI lab in Washington, and they made a positive identification of Karen Marsden. But at that scene was Carl Drew, was Robin Murphy, Carol Fletcher. A number of people were there who participated in that. Amazing events took place. So Robin kept telling the district attorney and the state police that we were harassing her. Sergeant Paul Kerry, who deceased only a few months ago. We would, Tom Joquin, Paul Kerry, and I would follow Robin almost all the time, around the clock. And she considered that harassment. I thought it was good police work. And she would she told the DA that we were harassing her and tormenting her. She was, of course, the chief witness for the Barbara Raposa homicide. So the DA didn't want, Ron Pena didn't want anything to happen to her. And I'm going to say this now, Ron Pena is still alive. He was the worst district attorney we ever had. I'll tell you that because I remember the Ann Caput case. You remember that case? He blew that. He did Big Dan's, he blew that. And the list goes on and on. He was really terrible. Anyway, I don't want to say any more bad things, although I have one. What? Yeah. I'm not sugarcoating. I'm telling you the truth. So I got one more thing to say about that, but that comes a little later. Anyway, they convinced the district attorney, Robin Murphy convinced the district attorney to put her in protective custody. Imagine this murderer. She killed these people. He sends her and another girl, a young lady, to Texas so we don't harass her. Can you believe it? She goes to Texas on the taxpayer's dime. She's down there with a young lady named Cookie. I don't know where she came from. But she's down there enjoying herself because she's in custody, protective custody, to testify against Andy Maltese. Now, lo and behold, lots of things happen, but I end up in Sonny Sparta's apartment. You were there to witness it. And Sonny Sparta gives me an opportunity to listen to the conversation with Robin calling her at Harbor Terrace. She gives me permission to make it illegal. She gives me permission. I listen. And in the conversation, she tells Sonny, don't worry. They'll never figure out it was me. Because I did what Lizzie Borden did. I took off all my clothes before I killed her. So I typed all of that out. It just so happened that that next day, we have a meeting with the district attorney and the state police in New Bedford on Purchase Street. But Teddy Cagle, who was my commander at the time, told me, do not take that report out of your pocket. Anybody read the book? Do not take that report out of your pocket until I tell you so. So we all get to sitting around the table, a conference table, a couple of CPAC detectives, Ron Pina, his secretary, the chief of police for Westport, his name was Dupere, Charlie Pierce, remember him? He was a chief of police. We're all sitting, they were very quiet, those guys, because this became very tumultuous. So we're all sitting around this table, and the DA sitting there, and the DA knows we had some information. They knew that. So don't forget, his witness is in Texas. So the DA says, okay, what do you got? We don't say anything. Teddy Cagle says, what have you got? DA jumps up and says, I'm not going to play this game. I'm not going to play this game. You guys have information that's important to this investigation. I want to hear it. So Teddy Cagle asked me to pull my report out, and I read it about what Robin had said on the phone and a few other things about how she killed Karen. Well, we were eating sandwiches at the time, and Pina took his sandwich, Ron Pina took a sandwich and threw it. Well, it landed on me, which I took as pretty offensive. To me, it was almost an assault. But he flipped out, and of course, the end result was immediately calling Robin and her girlfriend back from Texas that night. So they came back that night from Texas. The next day, they arrived, and they worked with Robin, and believe it or not, because they had her as a witness for the Barbara Raposa, believe it or not, she said she played such a small role in the murder of Karen, but was there. But it was all Carl Drew who did the whole thing. Pina was going to go with that, makes it a little easier. David Waxler was the prosecutor, and she ends up being the chief witness against Carl Drew at the trial. The trial was held in Fitchburg. We had a change of venue because it was so popular around here, you couldn't find a jury. So we had a change of venue. We go to Fitchburg, and we go out there for 3 weeks. So you can imagine, we're kind of like happy. Hey, we're going on vacation. We're going to be in Fitchburg for 3 weeks. Except we ended up working every night because we had to go over. We had literally thousands of reports that we had generated and others involving this case. So we never really had an opportunity to have a great time, except when we arrive, Tom Joquin wasn't with us, but when we arrive at the pub of the motel, it was one of those Yankee motels in Fitchburg. And of course, staying at the motel was the judge. His name was Francis Keating. Joe's laughing because it's so crazy. Francis Keating was the judge, and of course the state police were there, and David Waxler was there, and Paul Carey and I were there. So we get there early. We go right to the bar, of course. We go to the bar and we're drinking, raining like heck out. And I'll never forget this, what happens, but I find out the room that Dan Lowney is in, and Paul Fitzgerald, and I find out that room number, and on the back of a placemat, a red placemat, never forget it, I write, "The Fall River Cult Squad has arrived." And I take the tape, and I grab some tape, the bartender gives me, and I put it on the door of, that I assumed was Paul Fitzgerald, Dan Lowney. So about an hour passes, and the phone at the bar rings, and it's the bartender asking for me, and he says, "Did you put this placemat on my door?" I said, "Yeah, I did." "Well, you got a problem. You got to get up here. You put it on Judge Keating's door." And if any of you, now Joe knows Judge Keating, so doesn't Tom. He's not with us anymore. He's deceased. But Judge Keating was not somebody to fool with. I mean, this person would hold you in contempt of court. Like in a second, you go to jail. He was like a mean guy and very, very sharp man. So I go walking up. I'm trying to compose myself to think, what am I going to say to this judge? I had already had a few beers. What am I going to say about me putting this placemat on his door? So I knocked on the door, and I hear, "Come in." And it was Judge Keating sitting in front of me on the chair. I couldn't believe it. And he says, "Did you put this effing thing on my door?" I says, "Yes, Your Honor." But he says, "Get your ass in here and have a drink." They were all in the bedroom. This is a big joke, but it scared the hell out of me so much. That was sort of the beginning of what happened, because as we started the trial, people called in from Fall River and threatened our lives. So they never had metal detectors then in the courtroom. They had to bring metal detectors in from Boston into this courtroom to ensure that we were safe. It was an incredible trial. And of course, Carl Drew was convicted after Robin's testimony and spent all of his life so far there. He's appealed it twice. I testified in both appeals. The last one was about, 2 years ago. He was denied the appeals and remains for the rest of his natural life in jail. Robin Murphy, she had done 15 years, 16 years, and released on parole. She shortly thereafter violated her parole. She went back. They were getting ready to parole her again. What had happened was while she was incarcerated, when she was in Framingham, she would write letters like most people who are incarcerated do. But in one of her letters prior to her being released, they read, of course they read your mail, they read that she was going to, the first thing she wanted to do when she got out was to have pizza and kill Al and Silvia. Which was not a good thing to say. So she, needless to say, I ended up testifying at the commissioners at the parole board. I was the only person who was opposed for her release. She had about 30 people, ministers and everybody you can imagine, there to support her release. I was the only one opposed to her release, and they listened to me because she's never been released. So I'm thankful of that. She really shouldn't be released. She's been in jail now for all these years, 40 years. She really can't. She really couldn't be out here. As a matter of fact, her life would be in danger out here because she's so used to being incarcerated. There were a lot of things that happened during the commission of these crimes, and so many odd and bizarre things. As I mentioned, I went to Oswego, New York to learn more about cults. Shortly thereafter, a couple of years later, a young lady came in. She was an engineer at Raytheon, and so was her husband. And they were concerned about her son. They lived in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, but her son was hospitalized with 2 broken legs at St. Anne's Hospital. And his legs were not broken naturally, like from a fall or a car accident. They were broken people broke his legs. He was involved in a neo-Nazi group in Providence, started the neo-Nazi Satanist group in Portsmouth High School. And nobody could talk to him, but she wanted me to try talking to him. I don't know why she picked me. But anyway, I spoke with her. I went to St. Anne's. I spoke with her. He cried, this young man, 17 years old, and told me about they broke his legs and insisted that the people who did that to him loved him. I couldn't understand why his mother and father, he had a locked basement, but his mother and father were not allowed to go into the locked basement. I couldn't understand, because if I ever told my father, hey, look, there's a lock on the basement, I don't want you to go in there, I'd be dead. So I can't imagine a parent who say, I'm going to lock this basement, and I don't want you, a kid saying that to a parent. But that's the way it was. He had a locked basement, and they forbid his parents from going into the basement. Well, in there is where they would practice their little ritual or whatever they did. They had a book of shadows because they ended up getting a search warrant and going in there and finding those things. But as I met with the Portsmouth police prior to them searching the property, I had a meeting with the chief of police, and just so happened, the chief of police in Portsmouth and I went to Salve together. He was in some of the same criminal justice programs. So we went into this little room and to speak, and on the file cabinet behind me, I was sitting at a desk, he was sitting in front of me. On the file cabinet behind me was a GIQ. You remember GIQs, beer bottles, the big beer bottles? So it was a big beer bottle. And other evidence, it was an evidence room. It was, so if you were a young child, if you were below the age of 18 and you were found with alcohol, the police would seize that. They would arrest you for possession, minor in possession of alcohol, and they would tag that bottle with the date and the name. Back then, they would do a lot of that. So this bottle, which was evidence on the file cabinet, and as I'm talking to the chief about, because he wanted to know about the cult murders in Fall River, I started to explain to him, and I said, Chief, look, they worship Satan like you and I worship God. And when I said that, the bottle exploded. And it scared the hell out of me. Not only when it exploded, but I froze, and all the little fragments of glass stuck in my hair, all over the desk, beer all over the desk. He ran out of the room. He left me alone. And I just sat there. They sent a custodian in with a vacuum to vacuum my hair. And he said, look, I don't know what's going on with you, but don't come back to my department again. But that was one of like the bizarre things that happened with this. And I say evil. It was evil. It was totally surrounded by. I don't want to go and tell you. I prayed constantly throughout most of what happened. There were 2 documentaries made that are still shown. You can see them on YouTube when folks came into Fall River to film us about this crime. So it's received a lot of attention nationally and internationally. So again, when you look at the Lizzie Borden crimes and you look at this, I'm not trying to make a complete comparison, but totally bizarre and complex in comparison to all the little minutia that took place throughout this. Again, it could never be done again like this. It would never happen again like that. But it's all very interesting. And I know you have some questions, and I wouldn't mind having some other people talk. Joe Macy, perhaps you could say a few words on...
Oh, thank you, Alan. As you probably guessed or gleaned from Alan's talk, Alan and I know each other really well. We go back a long way, probably starting with this case. And we agree on a lot. It's the first time I've shared a speaking program with him about this subject, but he and I speak at a lot of veterans affairs because I'm a veteran, he's a veteran. But I do want to make one disclaimer. Unlike Alan, I've never worn polyester. Never. Going back to what he was talking about of Fall River in the days when he was an active investigator, the corner of Seabury and Bedford, across the street was Charlie's, down the street was the Pier 14. And I used to call it, and I think others did, the Golden Triangle, because there was nothing there but trouble. You couldn't drive down Bedford Street without almost running over a hooker or somebody looking for a hooker. It was just bizarre. But I remember when Carlton Viveris, the mayor, decided to clean up that area. And first thing he did was he closed the Pier 14, and I think Charlie's closed voluntarily. And then the pier was torn down, and Alan was still a police officer at the time. And I went to him, and I went to Paul Carey. I said, "What are you guys going to do now?" They said, well, "What do you mean? They've torn the place down." I said, "Yeah, you're not going to be able to solve any more crimes, because the way they used to solve the crimes was they'd go to the pier and they'd buy somebody a beer, and if they couldn't find somebody there who would squeal on somebody at Charlie's, they'd go to Charlie's." So their whole information system dried up when they tore down all those bars. But I do agree with Alan, and you'll find out I'm not going to talk too long, but I do agree with Alan on a number of things. Number one, they should have left the Fall River Police Department alone and let them investigate the case by investigating the case and not making these deals with these people who were not credible. That's the kindest way to put it. The more succinct way and more accurate way is that Robin Murphy took Ronnie Pina for a ride. And he bought it hook, line, and sinker. The police, the state police agreed, and I firmly believe, and I think Alan has, if he didn't say it explicitly, he certainly alluded to it, that the defendants still would have been defendants, but the murderer would have been somebody different. He mentioned Robin Murphy, and I think that was the case. And I always, after you try a case, and the Maltese case lasted 19 trial days, which is a long trial. That's almost a month. And, of course, it didn't work out very well for Andy, and not that well for me in a way, although I did, I think, a pretty good job. But you always think of what you could have done. Well, about 20 years later, or maybe more, the movie Forrest Gump came out. And I said, if Forrest Gump had been an active movie when I tried that case, I could have won it, because I would have said, what is this woman? Forrest Gump? She's at 3 different murders, sees them all and has nothing to do with any of them. So that was a problem. I think lack of investigation, although the Fall River Police did a good investigation, lack of perspective by the DA, and just making a deal that he really shouldn't have made. One of the things that's in the book that Alan didn't mention is Robin had also turned in 2 other guys, Willie Smith and Carl Davis, who were arrested, incarcerated, and then I wasn't that close to the case at the time, but I'm pretty sure she just went to Ronnie Pino and said, oh, guess what, I was only kidding, I changed my mind, and they let him out. Correctly. I mean, they should have let the 2 defendants out. So we've got the Golden Triangle, we've got the DA, and we've got me never wearing polyester. The trial itself was fascinating, at least from an attorney's point of view. I'm not going to go through it all. It was on television every night. A couple of interesting factoids, or whatever you want to call them. Ambrose Keeley, the medical examiner, was from Fall River. His father was the principal of Durfee High School when I graduated in 1961. So there was that Fall River connection, going back and forth. There was also the prurient interest in what was in Andy's trunk. And I wasn't going to tell this story, but Alan started it, and Pam knows what it is. Every day, I don't know why, I guess there wasn't much on television. Every day, that courtroom was packed. You couldn't get in. Once the courtroom seats were filled, they were filled. And there were these 2 old ladies that were there almost every day. Some days they wouldn't come, some days they would. So at one of the recesses in the trial, after the contents of Andy's trunk had been, put into evidence, these 2 old ladies came in, and I saw them talking to the court officer. And he said, well, you have to ask Mr. Macy. You have to ask Mr. Macy. So they came over, and I thought they wanted to get in early. I said, look, I don't handle the seating. I'm busy trying this case. You'll have to talk to the court officer. And they said, little tiny ladies, oh, Mr. Macy, we don't want to sit in a trial. We want to see the sexual implements. And I said, whoa, and really a lot of bizarre things happened in that trial, but that was one of them. And I couldn't show them to him because it wasn't my evidence. The other thing I will tell you on a more serious note, there's an interview that I had with Robin Murphy in the book, and Pam was right. The author of the book called me and asked me if I would, cooperate and tell him what Maltese told me. And I said, no, I'm not going to cooperate with you at all. And I always thought that he put my name in the book as Robert Macy just to get back at me, but he did spell my last name right. But speaking about the trial and how it went, Robin Murphy, and I tried cases for 30 years as a lawyer and 17 years as a judge, was the smartest, cleverest witness I ever had, bar none. And what happened was, and I still don't know why, the DA did this. In criminal practice, you can indict somebody, or once you arrest them, you have to give them a probable cause hearing within a certain number of days. The days were running out on Maltese, so they had a probable cause hearing at the Fall River District Court, which gave me a chance to cross-examine Robin Murphy. And I developed a lot of, reasonably good information. Then they indicted her while the trial was going on, indicted Maltese, came in, recessed, dismissed the case, and now she goes back on the witness stand about a year later in the Superior Court. And there she was. She looked, anybody remember Sacred Heart Academy? She looked like she just walked out of Sacred Heart Academy. Little, I'm not sure I have the names right, a little crew neck sweater, circle pin, a cross, the picture's in the book. And, Miss Demure Debutante. I said, oh, wow, not the Robin Murphy I know. Anyway, she takes the stand, and immediately I knew that she had memorized the transcript from the district court case. So there's a technique of examination called skipping, where you don't go step by step by step. You go to step 1, then you go to step 12, then you go back to step 9 to see if you can get people mixed up. Well, I went to step 1, then I went to step. By the time I got like 3 questions in, it was clear to me she knew what I was doing. And she didn't like it, and she wasn't prepared for it. So I asked her a few more questions, and next thing I know, she's like, maybe having a spell or something. But so I said to the judge, I said, hey, I didn't say hey, I said, may I approach the bench? And this was about not quite halfway through the trial, and the judge was about up to here with me. I was doing my job, I was being respectful, but I was also aggravating her. So she, gives me, what do you want to do now? Anyway, why do you want to approach the bench? I said, I got to approach the bench. So she lets me approach the bench, and I said, Judge, I think we got to do something about this witness. I think she's on something. She's rolling her eyes, she's rolling her head, and she's just about to get mad at me when Angelo, the court officer, comes up. He says, Judge, excuse me, I think the witness is going to faint. So she says, oh, really? So now she looks over at Robin. Take a recess. That's the end of the day. That was about 1, maybe, no, it was before lunch. So that's the end of the day. I said, uh-oh, this isn't going to end well. Sure enough, the next day, different Robin Murphy, different outfit, different attitude, well aware of not only the transcript, which she had reread, but now she's prepared for all this skipping business and what I'm going to ask her and that. And, she told a fairly incredible story, but she told it pretty well. And, she just was, and when I say I cross-examined a lot of people, I did. She was the cleverest, smartest witness I ever saw. And that was more or less the end of my side of the story. I know we're going to save some time for questions, but at this point, I think I'll quit while I'm ahead and give it back to Mr. Polyester.
Thank you, Joe. Great stuff. I didn't know Joe was going to be here, and I'm so happy that he was to fill us in on some of that with Robin Murphy. But, he just brings up some things. Well, start working your way up, Tom. He just brings up some things that we spent so many hours with Robin Murphy. I mean, I can't tell you how many hours I spent with Robin Murphy. Very scary when I think back about it. But Robin Murphy, I had a process too, and Tom will tell you that I was a halfway good interrogator. But I had a process where I would try to have people catch themselves in a lie. You couldn't do it with her. The other thing about Robin, which was really incredible, when you think of, this is a 17-year-old young lady. While we would watch her on occasion, I, at least on 2 occasions, saw her in fist fights. I saw her beat 2 guys up in front of Charlie's Cafe, and I'll tell you, it was a brutal fight. She was a very mean, vicious person. And her voice would change. In that room, I'll never forget, in Harbor Terrace, I thought it was a different person in the room, completely different. I don't mean like somebody, or something like that. I mean a completely different voice, which always brought us back to the thinking about cults and Satan and changing voices. But it was all very strange, Robin was. Oh, you have one, Mike.
I got one.
Well, we have lots of microphones here. Go ahead.
Well, basically, you've covered most things, but getting back to how violent Robin was in that fight you were talking about, I remember her actually smashing one of the guy's face on the concrete over and over again until she was pulled off. So she was an extremely violent.
Of course, we didn't get out of our car at all. We were watching her.
Actually, we spent many, many hours watching them. The state police used to have them at a hotel in Dartmouth to keep them away, to keep the witnesses away from us, and we would sit there and stake out the place. And that's what we did. Almost 24/7, we would sit there and stake out the hotel. So.
Talk louder.
Okay. That's all right. And Joe, you did a great job considering the way your hands were tied. You did well.
A couple of the incidents that happened that I didn't mention.
Well, you're talking about the seances they had in the apartments and all this stuff, it's hard to imagine. But the participants, not the principals, but the participants actually believed what was going on. I mean, Robin, Carl, again, they used this as a means of controlling the girls, and it worked very well. But you're talking, although Robin was like 17 at the time, the rest of the girls were all, 15 to 18. Some of them were a little older, but it was a control environment. They had to have total obedience, and Carl or even Robin would think nothing of backhanding any one of the girls just to keep them in line. So, I don't know. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions.
Any questions?
You can.
Any special incident funny that happened? We were trying to talk about funny things that happened.
Everything was funny.
Well, it wasn't that funny sometimes.
At the time,
but
yeah.
we had a lot of laughs throughout the whole thing as well.
Yeah.
But it was different, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Do you think they were responsible for other murders that went unreported?
The highway murders were totally different, have nothing to do with that period of time. I think not. I don't know of anything. I don't know if there's anything in your mind.
No,
that time.
absolutely not.
We had no missing persons. We had no. We had a lot of homicides, but we could account for all of them.
Right. And actually, that was something that was looked into very deeply, because again, we really did not have any idea how big this was. Again, we ended up with 3 individuals, or 3 victims, but we kept an eye on missing person reports and anything that crossed our desk. And in fact, we had a lot of interagency cooperation with Tiverton and Portsmouth and Little Compton and Somerset, Swansea. Everybody sort of shared information, and we were all actually very close at that time. We used to do a lot of search warrants together and stuff. So.
And before Robin Murphy went back to prison for breaking her parole, she actually had a state job.
Yeah.
How is that possible that someone...
But Suzanne Bump gave her a job. I don't know how she managed or manipulated them to do that, but she did. I've talked to the to Sue Bump about that, and she was interviewed, and she was given. They thought they were doing her a favor, but my issue was that there are lots of people who were never incarcerated, who are not felons, who deserved a job. And here she came back to the Fall River when she should have been 50 miles away from me, and not come back to a city that she had all these issues in. But that only led to her quick violation of parole, and huh? Yeah, luckily, thankfully, because I know for sure something else would happen. If not to me, somebody else.
Well, it's not a question per se, it's kind of like you guys went to the satanic meetings and stuff, and they knew you were police.
Yep.
I find that so strange, because I'm sure they didn't trust you. They
No,
knew
they didn't
that
trust
these
us.
murders were going on, and they weren't, like, they knew you were there to find stuff out.
We would go there, we'd give them beer, they loved that. We bring marijuana on occasion, they like that. We did a lot of things there, they tried to make a big issue out of that. We weren't investigating marijuana and beer. We were investigating homicide, so we wanted to find out as much information as we could. We probably went there more often than we should have. It wasn't a nice place to be. We were very uncomfortable. I was always very uncomfortable there.
So
but
they really didn't want you there?
They didn't want us there, but they had no
Oh.
choice.
It was like-
When they knocked on the door, they opened the door.
Yeah.
They're not gonna tell me to go away. They were fearful of us, but at the same time, they thought that they could pick our brain in some way. We continually find out information there, because people either would grab us coming out or walking in to tell us something that was happening or something. We were on top of it all the time. I can't think of a week during those 3 years that we went in Sonny Spotter's apartment.
No,
Don't
I mean,
forget,
when I
all
read
these
the
characters
book,
are
yeah.
dead. They're all dead. They've all died. They've all overdosed. They've all been.
And a lot of the stuff that went on, they did for our benefit. They were doing it to impress us,
And I
So,
thought it was weird how you had to watch the autopsy, and like you said, that was custom?
Oh, no, we have to
Oh.
do that by law.
That was so weird, I'm like,
We-
stay and watch it, that's weird.
Yeah, we do a couple of 3 autopsies a week.
yeah, at least. Yeah.
To do with your case?
No, he did not.
No.
He represented the defendant.
Yeah.
Robin Murphy won. Any other
Yeah.
questions?
Carl Davis.
Pardon?
Carl Davis is not alive, right?
Who?
Carl Davis. There's a
I don't know if Carl Davis is still alive, but he's not of these parts. I know that. I think they're all dead, to tell you the truth. So I was just saying, I own some apartments, and when Karen Marsden's son, of course, who she worried about the most, Karen Marsden's son, his name was JJ. So a few years after we solved these homicides, we would get together and we'd give him a bicycle Christmas time, and we sort of tried to stay in touch with him. Well, I'm leading to that. Don't ruin my story. So I have these apartments that I rent out in Fall River, and so I rented an apartment to this young man, and he comes to me after I rented it to him, and he says, "You know who I am? You knew my mother, Karen Marsden, JJ." Would you believe about 4 months later he had to go to treatment? He committed suicide. So it's amazing how this story continues to take on. Every month I get a call, an email from someone who's asking me a question about the cult murders. Of his death? Oh, he was maybe 3 years old. It was in the book, 3 or 4 years old. So he was just a little kid. He remembered us because we brought him a bicycle at Christmas time once. His grandmother, Ann Gabor, remember that name? Very much. So she worried so much about Karen, and of course they killed Karen that morning. But all in all, it's really an amazing story, and if you put the little minutia in the book together, some of the stories that are odd, it's pretty interesting. Any other questions? Yes.
There's a lot of allegations about prosecutorial misconduct, suppressing witnesses that had exculpatory information, dating back to a lot of people publicly. Is there any credibility to those allegations? Will Carl Drew raise them? Feels that witnesses were blatant or silenced?
There was some of that. Joe, maybe you can respond to some of that.
I'm not sure about the Drew case, but I know that in the Maltese case, I had an investigator who went around, you know, the highways and byways. These people didn't exactly hide, and was coming back with information where he's telling me, well, you know, I talked to so-and-so, but they said they already spoke to the police. I think they meant the state police, but, and there was so much of it that I made a motion in the Superior Court to dismiss the case based on withholding evidence. And then, lo and behold, the evidence showed up, the police reports showed up. And the excuse, which might have been true, I mean, I don't have a whole lot of love for the state police involved in the case, but I did respect the district attorneys who were trying the case, David Waxler and Ray Veery. Lo and behold, they found all the reports. And the excuse was, and this kind of goes to what you were talking about the DA, it was in the wrong file. Yeah, 150 pages in the wrong file.
You know, there are thousands of reports.
Unfortunately, they found it before the trial, so I got it in a timely fashion. Yeah, there was, in my case at least, it was almost withheld. In the Drew case, I did get a call from his second appeals lawyer, and I recall the conversation directly because he was asking me about withheld evidence, and I said, well, in my case, it was more or less misplaced, not withheld. And he said, well, can I call you as a witness? I said, yeah, you can, but let me tell you, Ray Veery, who tried the case on the other side, is an honorable guy. He's a good lawyer. Yep. And I will tell you, if you call me, that when he told me he didn't have it, I believed him. And when he told me he found it in the wrong file because of the way I knew that office worked, I believed him. I said, so I'm not going to be much help on a motion for a new trial.
Yeah. And you know, there were a couple of issues that came up in the Carl Drew trial that I remember. Attorney Berkness, who that's the photo of me in the book with that attorney, that young kid. I look very much like I do now. I haven't changed much at all. But there were some issues. I know Joe represented me on another case where there was exculpatory evidence involved, but we won't go there. But it was, but we, you know, there was information that maybe in sometimes were not reported as part of the case because of the confusion with the state police and CPAC unit. And I know that we had thousands of reports generated over the 3 years of that investigation, stacks. I even, when I was called to testify for Carl Drew's appeal, I asked for them to pay me because I needed to have at least 10 hours to review some material. I wanted to go over some of the information on the offense reports from the crime, but that never happened. I went in cold turkey and did it, and he was still found not to be granted an appeal. So it is truly an amazing case. Now, something that's not in the book, after, of course, these things happened later. Paul Carey, who was a great investigator, somebody who we worked for, he was our sergeant. He was our street sergeant at night. Very good investigator, older than we are, if you can imagine. But he only died about 4 or 5 months ago. But after he retired, he moved to Maine. And he sort of became a recluse. And sort of like, if you see him, you look like Nanook of the North, you know, with a beard and living in the woods. And he would call me always, at least once a month, and to talk about this case. Really had an effect on him mentally. It did a lot of things to him. I told Tom, I don't know how we managed not to get sent to some asylum.
So you want all that marijuana?
The marijuana did it. Cannabis helped us. That'll be in the paper tomorrow. Thank you very much. But he was an excellent investigator. But somehow or another, he really believed over the past 10 or 15 years, he had believed Carl Drew was innocent, and he testified on behalf of Carl Drew at the Carl Drew appeal that I testified against him. Never thought I would testify against my partner in the case, but he was so sure that he could convince a judge that Carl Drew was being framed by Robin. And we know that Robin was the mastermind behind all of the homicides, but Carl Drew was present. It sort of evolved that way. Carl Drew has his own web page. I don't know how you do that out of jail, but he has his own web page and friends and people who support his innocence. And Paul Carey was a strong supporter. So that makes this case with an even more bizarre twist, that the investigator who worked with us, we're the last two surviving investigators on the case. All the state police investigators are dead. Everyone is gone. There's only a few defense attorneys left. No. No. But it's pretty amazing that no one's left. That's why I say, I told Tom earlier tonight, I said, you know, we actually saved Robin and Carl Drew's life. They'd be dead. We're doing them a favor. Of course, not where they are, but they're alive. Incredible story. Anyone have? Hi.
Yeah, I read the book many years ago, and I don't remember. How many years did Robin get, and what did she do with mine?
Well, she...
2042, she's up there.
Now, I'll probably be called if I'm alive to go and testify in opposition of her being released on parole, and I'll be there. So she really is. Of all of the people that I've ever had contact with in the many thousands, a few thousand arrests that I've made, and some pretty dangerous people, she is probably the most unstable, vicious. I used to say she could eat pizza and kill you. Well, she said she wanted to eat pizza and kill me. She could eat pizza and kill you. Yes, sir.
I just have a comment. I grew up in a three-decker on 3rd Street. We lived on the 2nd floor, and Robin Murphy and their mother and stepfather lived on the 5th floor above us. And she used to like my younger brother. And she was like 11 or 12 years old. She was such a sweet little girl, and she'd be in my mother's house all the time. And when I heard all of this unfolding, it's like, there's got to be another Robin Murphy. They can't be talking about the same kid. She was such a sweet little girl, and I guess that's...
I knew her stepfather. I met most of the family along the way. You know, they had issues.
I found it so hard to believe when I was reading it. Everything was unfolding. It's like, my God, she was such a nice...
She was definitely a victim of sexual abuse as a child, and so wasn't Carl. I mean, Carl was actually expelled from the Sidewinders. Who gets expelled from the Sidewinders? You got to be a misfit to get expelled from a motorcycle gang like that, right? So he was expelled from the Sidewinders. You can't do that. That doesn't happen. So he had lots of problems, and so they were a perfect match for each other. She feared Carl Drew. Probably the only person that I knew she feared was Carl Drew. She didn't fear many other people. She didn't fear us.
I met Robin Murphy when I was 13, right at the same area that you're talking about. Which grew up, friend, her name was Joy. She lived right around the same area. We used to hang out every day.
Yeah.
My best friend. And she told me she hung out in the same area that we lived. We hung out at. And she told me Robin Murphy, she didn't say her last name, Robin Murphy and her friends are going to be there. She said, she told me she's kind of crazy. She's crazy, and don't say anything to her. And because she's going to be there tonight. And I said, okay. I remember saying, okay. And just say hi to her and don't say nothing else. And so I said, all right.
Yeah, she was crazy.
And to this day, so many years later, I remember what she looked like, and I remember looking at her long, brown, silky hair. She was so beautiful, but there was something in her eyes. And she had the darkest eyes. And I looked, I think I said hi to her, and I was scared, because we were so young and crazy at the time that I wasn't afraid of anything, but I was afraid of her. And I said hi, she didn't say nothing to me, she just looked at me and looked away.
Yep. Any other questions? Anybody have anything else?
I let Colin do it.
Any questions, anyone?
Was Carl here from Fall River?
Yes. Originally from
New Hampshire.
Yeah, New Hampshire.
Originally from New Hampshire.
Questions, anyone? Yes, sir.
Whatever happened with Carl Davis?
Carl Davis, again, we don't know. He lived in this area. We know that he had been arrested a number of times. Carl Davis was implicated by Robin as being part of, as Judge Macy mentioned, she was part of the, and then she later recanted her story and said they had nothing to do with it. They were released. We never saw them again. They didn't testify at anyone's trial. They weren't involved in anything. Don't know if they're alive or dead. They could be gone. Many of these people are gone. Yes.
Were any of the family like involved in the testimony?
The family, the only family that I knew some of Margarita Reverito. Anyone remember that name? That was Carl Drew's girlfriend. And some of Robin's family. I met her stepfather and mother at one point in time. But of course, I knew all of Karen's family, the mother and the grandmother, Ann Gabor and Jay, but not many others. I knew none of the Barbara Raposa folks. Yes?
Why was Doreen Levesque killed?
Doreen Levesque was killed because Robin and Carl told her to stay off the street. She was working the street in Fall River near the pier. They didn't want her working the street. Doreen was a very pretty young lady. And she would come from New Bedford. She'd work the street. But they warned her. And the second time when they saw her is when they picked her up. They brought her all around. I don't even know if it's in the book, but I remember this. They took her down Eagleville Road, and they beat the hell out of her in that car. They pulled her hair out. They beat her to near death in the car. Before, they had sex with her. Before they brought her to Diamond, all of that transpired. You remember any more than that? No. But at Diamond is when she already had no pants on. She had no underwear. When we found her face down tied, again, when I say that, I see her. You see her. It's hard. You know, when you see and it's happened to me 35 times, when you see a body in that position and you know it's a violent death, it stays with you. Why? One of the reasons why, as a homicide investigator at the time, I always wanted to be at the crime scene because I want to feel that. I want to feel that to be able to continue to do an investigation. I couldn't just show up 2 days later and say, well, where was the body found? I wanted to feel that. And when you see that, it's vivid and it stays with you. But Doreen was only killed for the fact that she worked the streets where Robin and Carl told her not to work. They killed her.
There's a YouTube video on it. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a documentary that I did with a film company called, I don't know, I think they do like true crime but you can see it on YouTube. They came to Fall River and I was part of the filming. Yeah. It's an actress. Any other questions? I want to thank Pam. This was an incredible idea because I never thought about it, but now we know we're going to do it again. We're going to have to get a hall now. But there's a lot of interest, and I thank all of you. And if any of you have any questions for us, we'll be happy. We're going to be here. We'll be happy to hang around and talk to you. Thank you all very much. Have a great night.